Hey, this is Sam Black with my third match with this Black-Red Vintage Cube deck. I am, I believe, on the play, and I have Thoughtseize and some mana and an Ulamog. This hand doesn't have a clear thing that it's going to do, but it does have a good baseline, so I'm just going to keep it as a regular hand as opposed to a hand that I know can combo. If I draw Sneak Attack or any of my 3 tutors for Sneak Attack, I'm doing something great. Alternatively, if I just draw any of my 6 mana creatures, I can play it on turn 5. Yeah, I don't think... Well, no, I can play Accelerator on 2, Accelerator on 3, and cast on 4 if I draw a land. So that would also be a good thing to do, playing Wormcoil Engine or Grave Titan. And as you can see, I held off on the Thoughtseize, which I think is a mistake given what I was just saying about if I draw a land, being able to cast a 6-drop on 4, spending all of my mana on turns 2, 3, and 4. So this was the only turn where I could have played the Thoughtseize without it disrupting what I was doing. So I think that waiting was a mistake. My thinking was, in general, my deck is trying to make a big play, and Thoughtseize later protects that big play, but I think given the nature of my hand, it would have been better to just use it. My opponent flips Delver, revealing Daze, which is a significant card to know about. So now I don't want to play Chalice on 2 this turn, so I'm just going to Thoughtseize here. I see Chrome Mox, Daze, Kolaghan's Command, Time Walk, with 2 more islands. So my opponent is not super close to casting Kolaghan's Command, and Kolaghan's Command isn't really that big of a deal. I know about Daze. Chrome Mox is just a mana source, so I'm going to take Time Walk, even though honestly Time Walk isn't that impressive on this board. Once I terminate the Delver, Time Walk is basically just cycle and put a land into play. It's Explore, but it's still the best card in my opponent's hand. So terminate the Delver, and now, well, neither one of us really has anything going on. So now I'll just play the Chalice for 2 to kind of turn off Daze. My opponent has drawn black mana, red mana, so Kolaghan's Command is on. But I drew Vampiric Tutor, so I'm almost certainly going to win, as I can just tutor for Sneak Attack. And I know a vast majority of my opponent's cards. So my opponent Inquisitions, I can just respond with Vampiric Tutor. And now my opponent's Inquisition misses. Their hand is Kolaghan's Command, Chrome Mox, Daze, and 1 unknown. No, maybe 1 island. So anyway, none of that interacts with Sneak Attack, so I'll cast it, Sneak Attack in Ulamog, Ulamog my opponent's lands. Now my opponent has 1 land and half their life. And I played the mountain, which I don't think I should have done. My thinking was that my opponent was pretty far off from Kolaghan's Command, but there's just no upside to putting the mountain into play there. I draw Crucible, play Crucible, and now, if it weren't for the fact that Sneak Attack can be used as an instant, the Kolaghan's Command that my opponent can cast in my draw step here would really punish me for playing the mountain. But as is, my opponent is going to go for the Kolaghan's Command, and I'm going to respond by sneaking in Ulamog, and now my opponent is tapped out, and Ulamog attacks for their entire life total. In the second game, I am on the draw, and this hand is not good. It's 4 basically uncastable creatures, a Terminate that I would need to draw red for. So I mulligan, and I sided in Desecration Demon because my opponent didn't seem to have a lot of creatures, and it can be hard to deal with and present a fast clock. So if I draw a swamp, I can just cast Desecration Demon on turn 3, so that seems pretty good. I obviously don't want to draw Ulamog. So now I can't do anything other than play the Signet, but Ritual opens up some options with this hand. So now I have 4 mana. I could play Sneak Attack, but it doesn't really accomplish anything, so I'm just going to play Chalice Kick twice, which allows me to play and activate Sneak Attack the next turn. And that resolves. My opponent's going to cast Thirst, and then blow up my Chalice, and I'm going to discard Terminate, and I'm just going to Ritual and play the Demon here because I don't have anything else going on. My opponent's going to Ancestral Recall. My opponent plays Jace, and top, and Time Walk. So now my opponent can flip Jace and cast Ancestral Recall or Time Walk. So my opponent flips Jace and casts Painful Truths, and then Time Walk. So my opponent has drawn 3 twice and taken 2 extra turns. And I've mulliganed and used a Ritual to play a Desecration Demon on a turn when I could have played it if I just had a swamp. So things aren't really going great for me. And my opponent's going to play a Dimir Signet and miss with an Inquisition of Kozilek. And then cast Dig Through Time. So, and then Ashiok me. And plus Jace, but that doesn't stop the demon from killing Jace. And I'm going to play Pack Rat. My opponent's going to Careful Study, activate Ashiok again, play Temple of Deceit. At this point they've seen almost their entire deck. And somehow the demon is still alive. I'm going to try to kill Ashiok here. And unfortunately my opponent has Torrential Gearhulk to Dig Through Times. Now they've officially seen every card in their deck. And the Gearhulk blocks Pack Rat, but I'm going to make another rat and put Ashiok down to 1. My opponent's going to use top. And then Mindslaver me. Fortunately, I can't really do anything that horrible to myself here, depending on what I draw. When I draw Faithless Looting, which is not a card you want to draw under Mindslaver, I draw Mind Twist and Grim Tutor. And my opponent elects to discard the Mind Twist and the Grim Tutor, which is interesting. They could instead use the Mind Twist on me, because it's target player, to leave me with no cards in hand, but I think they decided that it's more important to get rid of the Faithless Looting, so they just cast Faithless Looting again, and they decide to discard the creatures and leave me with Sneak Attack, and then obviously suicide the Pack Rat into the Torrential Gearhulk, and pass, and unfortunately my opponent has Diabolic Edict. And that lets them deal with the Desecration Demon, which makes me wonder if I had just not attacked with the Pack Rat. I had no way of knowing that my opponent had Gearhulk, but if I had not attacked with the Pack Rat, then the Mindslaver only could have killed one of the two Pack Rat tokens, and then Edict wouldn't have been an answer to the demon, and I wonder if the demon would have just beaten my opponent's entire deck. But that's not how things played out. So my opponent plays Delver, hits me with the Gearhulk. I draw Strip Mine, strip my opponent's only red source. My opponent plays Temple of Epiphany, getting a red source again. Activates Ashiok. I draw Vampiric Tutor. I have 6 cards in my deck. One of them is Ulamog, and I know at this point that Ulamog is the bottom card of my deck, but full disclosure, I forgot. But watching the replay, I remember that I did scry it to the bottom. So I know that. So my thinking here was that I have 3 cards in my deck and one of them is Ulamog and I don't know which one. In reality, I could have known that it was the bottom. If I tutor for if I draw Ulamog, then I can sneak attack Ulamog, attack Ashiok presumably. My opponent most likely loses 4 islands, roughly, blocks with Delver, and then kills me with Torrential Gearhulk. There's nothing I can do about that. So the alternative is that I can wait until my opponent attacks and then sneak attack in Ulamog to block the Gearhulk, and then reshuffle my graveyard with the Ulamog trigger. My opponent gets to put Ashiok up to 11, or my opponent at that point could just cast Grave Titan with Ashiok, or could go up to 11 and be ready to cast Ceaseless Hunger. Does it cast? Put into play. I assume that Delver is not flipping at this point. I think that if my opponent has probably used Dig Through Time to take every card that could flip it out of their deck, but maybe there's still a Daze or something floating around. This Daze hasn't been used, but my opponent might have sided it out since I saw it in the previous game. So I think I'm losing regardless. Anyway, I elect not to use the Vampiric Tutor because being at 2 seems pretty bad here. And I draw Reanimate, which can't do anything to save me. And then for the third game, I'm on the play again. And I really should have sided out Damnation. I just forgot about it. My opponent doesn't have anywhere near enough creatures to want it, but I keep the hand despite it. Put the land on the bottom. Cast Signet. Opponent also casts the same Signet, and I believe that I Imperial Seal here. Options. I could just get Dark Ritual so that I can Ritual Grave Titan next turn, but that only puts me one turn faster to resolving it. I think that the correct thing to get is Mind Twist. I don't remember if that's actually what I got. And I don't think this tells me, so we'll just see what I decided to do. Inquisitions and takes the Imperial Seal, and then Careful Studies. So if I did get Mind Twist, this is going to go pretty well. I got Sneak Attack. And my opponent assumes that if I'm tutoring for Sneak Attack, I have something great to put into play. They try to use Wheel of Fortune to get rid of it, and unfortunately for them, they got rid of Grave Titan, which is fine, and wheeled me into Vampiric Tutor, so I can just Vampiric Tutor for Ulamog. I wait until my turn to do it to play around Daze. And I went for this Ulamog because my opponent has 20 cards in their library. So it is immediately lethal, unlike the other Ulamog. But unfortunately, my opponent has Diabolic Edict. Which, knowing that that's their removal for a big creature, I really should have just reanimated my Grave Titan in advance. So I don't love the way that I've played this game so far. But now I can just play Rakdos Signet, play Faithless Looting, find other Ulamog, reanimate Grave Titan. My opponent flips Delver and I'm down to 10. My opponent casts Painful Truths and Jace and attacks me with the Delver. And I'm going to flashback Faithless Looting, find some cards, put Ulamog into play, attack with everything, make more zombies. My opponent loses a bunch of permanents and takes a bunch of damage. Block Ulamog because it's lethal. So now my opponent has 3 lands and a Delver, and my question is whether I want to cast Thoughtseize. And I realize that the way that I can lose this game is if I Thoughtseize my opponent, go down to 5, and then they draw Kolaghan's Command, and Kolaghan's command me for 2 and hit me with Delver, and I die. So I decide that it's best not to cast Thoughtseize, and I don't think that my opponent has the ability to put together 4 more damage, which means that the Grave Titan should just be lethal. And that's what happens. So that was the draft. I don't think I played this game well, but clearly I played it. It didn't matter that much. The decisions that I made were worse. Each of the mistakes definitely lowered my win percentage, but they were marginally worse, I think, overall. So that was good enough. As for this deck, I think that it came together reasonably well. I think that this... I mentioned earlier that this was not a deck I've drafted before, which is basically just that usually when I'm trying to assemble these combos, I'm relying more on blue cards to do it, looking for stuff like Brainstorm and Preordain and Ponder and Impulse, sometimes Mystical Tutor, but clearly between Demonic, Vampiric, Imperial Seal, Grim Tutor, there are a lot of black cards that let you put these 2-card combos together, and that's basically what this is. It's just a tutor deck where you just get as many halves of 2-card combinations that essentially win the game as possible, and then try to string together the 2 halves with tutors, and then round out the deck with whatever disruption you happen to find, and ideally have some backup plans to use your combo pieces. Stuff like Grave Titan that plays either as a reasonable thing to sneak attack or to reanimate, or you can just cast. But I think base black, I'm going to do something unfair, is a fairly standard and fairly effective cube strategy. It can often have trouble with blue decks in particular. I think the main thing you're worried about is decks that can counter your combos or decks that just don't give you enough time. So something like red aggro or blue with a lot of counter spells. And the right removal can protect you significantly against red aggro, and then you need cards like Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek to force your spells through to protect you against blue. But I think as long as you have access to all that and you get a few good combos and some tutors, it's a pretty reliable archetype.